Hi everyone, I hope you're having a peaceful day. Today's story takes us to the quiet farm where Tieu tends her garden until a sudden pain changes everything. As she collapses in the middle of the field, doctors warn her condition is critical. Far away, Officer Lee is still deep inside his undercover mission when the call comes, forcing him to choose between duty and the woman carrying their child. What will he do when love and mission collide? If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell, so you won't miss the next chapter of Sam and Lee. Morning spreads over the garden like milk poured through leaves. Dew clings to the cabbages, each head tight and glossy, as if the plants had spent the night learning how to hold themselves together. Tieu moves slowly down the rows with her watering can, the brim of her hat shading her eyes. The earth smells rich and clean. Chickens gossip by the fence. The breeze lifts the corners of her shirt. She talks to the beds the way she always does. "Just a little longer," she whispers. "Grow steady, grow safe." She imagines harvest day the way other people imagine a holiday. Baskets lined up on the porch, the soft thud of full leaves, the small pride of work that became life. Her palm rests for a beat on the gentle rise beneath her waistband. It is still new enough to feel like a quiet miracle only she can hear. She hasn't told Lee. The words keep forming and unforming at the back of her throat. "When he's home," she thinks. "When he's home, I'll say it right." The sun climbs warm on the back of her neck. She sets the can down to pull a few weeds, breathes, straightens. Then a sharp stitch rips across her lower belly, sudden and wild. It steals her breath so cleanly she makes no sound, just a hand gripping the bamboo stake beside her. The second wave is worse, hot and cramping, the ground tilting under her knees. She tries to stand, the world narrows. A mist gathers at the edges of her sight. Somewhere, a rooster crows too brightly for the moment. She crouches again, this time not in peace but in necessity, one arm across her abdomen as if she could hold the hurt back with fingers alone. "Sam, do you want the corn husks for the chickens?" a neighbor calls from the lane. Tieu opens her mouth, can't find air. It takes everything to lift her head. "Please, help me." The last syllables thin into a hiss. The neighbor drops the sack and runs, hands under her shoulders, voices rising. The yard blurs into a soft rush of green and brick. Then a motorbike's engine catches and roars. Someone wraps a scarf around her. Another hand steadies her head. The road shakes beneath them as if the whole valley had decided to move at once. At the clinic, the light is too white. Nurses speak in practiced calm, the kind that knows fear will copy your tone. Blood pressure cuff, thermometer. Questions she tries to answer and cannot. A doctor with serious eyes guides her onto the examination bed and says her name carefully, as though saying it softly might change the outcome. "Rest now," the doctor tells her after a long minute that feels like a held breath. "No sudden movement. We need to monitor you. It's early, but it's real. You understand?" The word hangs there, real, and tears spring without warning. She nods because nodding is easier than speech. The doctor's voice is gentle but blunt. Threatened miscarriage, bed rest, observation, fluids, call family. "Stress is not your friend today," the doctor adds almost like a prayer. "Breathe for two." Tieu's neighbor squeezes her hand. "We'll call Oang," she says. "She'll know how to reach him." Him. It is the first time the room feels airless. She turns her face to the wall, and stares at the pattern the light makes on the curtain as it moves, leaf shadow and sun-wash trading places. She pictures the garden still standing, the watering can tipped on its side, a line of ants detouring around the puddle. She counts her breaths, one steady, one shaky, and tells the quiet inside her, "Stay. Stay with me." Far away, the day is made of smoke and clipped orders. In a warehouse that pretends to be empty, Lee, Nam, to the men who don't know, listens to the plan for nightfall. A map on a crate, fingers tapping roots, a truck due in after dusk. He keeps his shoulders loose and his mouth still. The right-hand man grins around a toothpick and says, "You drive, no questions." Lee moves like he has nothing else to do in this world. Inside, he is busy with measures, angles, faces, where to stand when the wrong thing happens. His phone is off. It is always off when the circle tightens. He is careful about hope, careful about everything. When he steps outside to the strip of shade behind the building, the sky is a hard sheet of heat. He lets the brightness strike his eyes for a moment to clear the smoke from them. He is thinking of taillights and signal times when a second phone, the one he keeps wrapped in tape and rainproof plastic, buzzes once against his ribs. It should not buzz. It has not buzzed in weeks. He checks the angle. Alone. He turns his back to the door and answers. "Lee?" The voice is low, urgent, trying to sit on panic and failing. It's Oan. Every muscle tenses the way wire tightens. "Sister?" "She's at the clinic," Oan says. "Sam, they're keeping her for observation. The doctor says it's early and fragile. She needs someone." For a second, the world blanks. Noise folding into a single, distant hum, like a train holding its breath in a tunnel. He presses the phone harder to his ear, as if closeness could wring different words from it. "Is she?" "They're trying to keep it," Orn says simply. And in that gentleness is the whole truth. "Come if you can. If you can't, I'll stay. But Lee..." Her voice dips. She shouldn't be alone for this. Behind him, a door scrapes. A man laughs. Someone kicks a crate. Lee ends the call and slips the phone deep in his pocket, letting his hand stay there until his fingers stop shaking. When he turns back inside, the map on the crate has not moved. The toothpick still points at the same road. The plan is the same. Only he is different. Split straight down the middle, one life staring at the other, both unwilling to blink first. He could tell himself what he always tells himself. Finish the job, then go home. But the picture forms uninvited. Sam on a narrow bed under too white light, her hand pressed to her belly, her eyes fixed on the spot where the curtain breathes. He thinks of promises you cannot repair if they break the first time. He thinks of all the ways men vanish without anyone saying goodbye. The scar-faced man claps him on the shoulder. "Tonight, brother," he says. "Big step, don't be late." Lee nods. He even smiles. He is good at this. He is good at not letting the face betray the heart. He palms the truck keys as if accepting a crown. He pockets them. He pockets the decision he is already making. By late afternoon, the heat gives up a degree and the sky turns the color of dull metal. Lee slips away on an errand no one bothers to track. A coil of rope, a pack of smokes, a thing men like them are always allowed to go by. He takes the long path between buildings and does not look over his shoulder. At the corner, he becomes a pedestrian, then a shadow, then another man on another street. The road to the clinic is a line he walks without remembering how he turned. He trades one motorbike for another, pays cash for the taxi that comes next. His cover, name, posture, habits, stays in place out of reflex, the way a hand stays up to block a blow even when the blow is no longer coming. At the clinic, the world smells like antiseptic and nervous breath. A TV murmurs in the waiting room. No one watches it. He asks for her name, and the nurse looks at him for one long second, measuring need and authority, then nods toward the corridor. "Third door, right side, but be quiet. She's resting." He walks the corridor, counting tiles. Each step is a decision repeated. His fingers hover over the handle, then close. He pauses. One breath to gather the parts of himself that's scattered on the road here. On the other side of the thin door, the woman he loves and the small, trembling future they have not yet spoken aloud. He leans his forehead to the cool paint, shuts his eyes and finally turns the latch. The sound of the door opening was barely a whisper, but to Lee it felt like thunder rolling through his chest. Inside, the light was soft, filtered through a curtain that moved gently with the breeze. Tieu Sam lay still on the narrow bed, an IV line trailing from her arm, her skin pale against the white of the sheets. Her hair fanned across the pillow, a few strands clinging to the damp edges of her face. For a moment, he couldn't move. He just stood there, every part of him frozen between guilt and relief. She was alive, breathing, here. When she stirred, her lashes fluttered, and her eyes found him through the haze of exhaustion. "Lee." Her voice was barely a breath, part disbelief, part fragile joy. He stepped closer, swallowing the 1,000 things he wanted to say.
"I'm here," he said softly. "It's all right now." She tried to sit up, grimacing. "You shouldn't be." "Don't!" He cut her off gently. "You need to rest." He reached for her hand. It was small and cool, and when he wrapped his fingers around it, he felt her pulse flutter like a bird under his thumb. The silence between them was heavy, but not empty. It carried everything unsaid. The nights she spent waiting, the danger he'd walked through, the secret she'd kept inside her body. When she finally spoke again, her voice trembled. "I didn't mean for you to come. They said I was stable. You shouldn't have left the mission." Lee shook his head slowly. "There are some missions you don't finish if it means losing what you're fighting for." His tone was calm, but there was something raw beneath it.
He sat beside her, eyes tracing the curve of her face, the IV drip, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. "Tell me what happened." She turned her face away, eyes wet. "It started suddenly. I was in the garden. I thought it was nothing. Maybe just tired, but then it hurt so much I couldn't stand." Her voice cracked. "The doctor said it was a threatened miscarriage. I was so scared, Lee, I thought—" Her hand drifted to her stomach, trembling. He placed his palm over hers, steady and warm. "Don't. It's okay now. You're strong. Both of you." She tried to smile, but the corners of her mouth quivered. "You knew?" "I didn't," he admitted quietly. Owen called. "I came as fast as I could." Then after a beat, he whispered, "If I'd known sooner." The thought hung in the air, unfinished but understood. Outside, the hallway hummed with distant footsteps. A nurse peeked in, nodded politely, then disappeared again. The stillness returned, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. Lee looked around the small room. The metal tray with folded gauze, the smell of antiseptic, the faint drip
of the IV, and something inside him cracked. He had spent months pretending to be someone else, living among danger and deceit. But this room, this fragile life before him, felt more real than anything he had seen out there. He reached for a glass of water, lifted it to her lips. "Drink a little," she obeyed, eyes never leaving his face.
"You look thinner," she murmured. "Tired." He smiled faintly. I could say the same. They stayed like that for a long time, saying little, letting the quiet do the talking. When the doctor entered, Lee stood immediately. The man was kind-eyed, professional, and when he spoke, his tone was firm but gentle. "She's stable now," the doctor said, "but it's critical that she rests. No stress, no heavy work. The next few days are important." Lee nodded. Understood. The doctor hesitated before leaving. "You're her husband?" Lee paused, then said simply, "Yes." It wasn't quite true, but it wasn't a lie either. When the door closed again, Sam turned toward him. "You shouldn't have said that," he shrugged. "It felt right." Her lips curved, weak but real.
Maybe it was. Outside, the rain had begun. A thin drizzle tapping against the window, the sound steady and soft. Lee watched it trail down the glass, streaks merging into one another like time slipping quietly away. He knew he couldn't stay long. His absence would already be noticed. But every time he looked at her, every time she shifted slightly and winced, the idea of leaving grew impossible. Finally, she broke the silence. "You'll have to go back, won't you?" His shoulders tensed. "Yes." Her gaze lowered. "When?" "Tomorrow," he said. "Maybe tonight?" She turned her face into the pillow. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, softly, "I hate that I understand." He smiled sadly. "That's what makes you braver than anyone I know." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'll finish this soon, I promise." "You always say that," she whispered. "And I always mean it." A small laugh escaped her, brittle, tired, but sincere. "If our child grows up hearing that, you'll have to keep your word this time." The sentence caught him off guard. Our child. He felt it land deep inside him, where all his masks fell away. He leaned forward and kissed her hand. "Then I will." The rain thickened, turning the clinic windows into blurred mirrors. A nurse came in briefly to check the IV. "If she rests, the baby will be fine," she said, smiling, then left.
When the room was quiet again, Sam whispered, "I was afraid you wouldn't come." He looked at her, eyes steady. "Even if I didn't, my heart would." Her eyes softened, and for a second, it felt as if the world outside the room had ceased to exist. No missions, no gangs, no lies, just two souls breathing in rhythm. But reality crept back in as he checked his watch. He stood slowly, reluctant. "I'll stay until you sleep." She nodded, half asleep already, murmuring something that sounded like, "Don't go too far." He waited until her breathing steadied, until her hand went slack in his. Then he sat there, head bowed, listening to the rain. Every drop outside seemed to echo the ticking inside his chest. Duty on one side, love on the other, both pulling with equal force. He thought of the men he had to meet again, the gang that wouldn't hesitate to end him if they knew the truth. When he finally rose, the curtain fluttered one last time, brushing against her wrist. He bent close, whispered, "I'll come back soon, I swear it." Then he turned and walked out, every step heavier than the last. Outside, the rain washed the streets clean, but not his thoughts. His motorbike waited under a street lamp, droplets collecting on the seat. He looked back once, through the clinic window, faint light glowing where she slept. Then he started the engine, the sound swallowed by rain. Sometimes love asks for sacrifice, but sometimes it demands something harder. To stay alive, to keep choosing each other even when the world pulls you apart.